Good morning. Is there anyone out there? Okay. Good morning to the survivors of CCAS 2021. We are really still excited about being here live and being able to close the session, the conference, with a wonderful plenary entitled Slanted, How an Asian American Troublemaker Took on the Supreme Court with Simon Tam. Simon is an author, musician, activist, and a self-proclaimed troublemaker, even though you couldn't tell by looking at him. He's best known as the founder and bassist of the Slants, the world's first and only all-Asian American dance rock band. Simon approaches art and activism with radical optimism and compassion. In 2017, he won a landmark case at the U.S. Supreme Court, helping to expand civil liberties for marginalized groups. His work has been highlighted in over 3,000 media features across over 150 countries, including Rolling Stone, Time, NPR, BBC, and the New York Times. And he's joined on stage by guitarist Joe Giant. Simon?
Thank you so much for having us. So of course we decided to incorporate a bit of music because we can, and we love to be able to do that. And I think it also just illustrates gives you a better idea of what we do as artists, as activists, as folks trying to change the culture in this world. So this first song is a song called 1821, and it originally started off with this idea that I had with the Radio Lab, the WNYC Studios production from NPR, and they kind of wanted to put on a more modern day version of School of Rock or Schoolhouse Rock, and except they wanted artists from across the country to teach about the each of the 27 Bill of Rights. And our band is mostly known for winning a First Amendment case at the Supreme Court. And so, of course, they asked us to do that, but I thought it was just a little too on the nose. And so instead, I like thinking of obscure things and obscure perspectives. And I was like, what if we did two amendments, the 18th and the 21st Amendment? Because I thought it would be a fun way to illustrate this idea. You know, America was kind of in its early developmental era and experimenting with things, and of course passed the 18th Amendment, which is prohibition. And it wasn't until they realized it didn't work out, it was a disastrous idea, that they repealed it using the 21st Amendment. But I thought, that's kind of like growing up. You know, when you're a kid, you think, when I turn 18, I can do whatever I want. Turns out you cannot even get a glass of wine or a beer or anything like that. It's not until you turn 21. So why not use this as kind of a way to illustrate both the country growing up as well as us as we're kind of figuring out our identity and where those rules ought to lay.
Remember counting the days, remember grasping for moments when freedom was a digit away. Remember thinking the world closed up on you like an islet, peering through sea and proof. Remember when you were teenage, staring up at the ceiling, emotions like a runaway train. Remember making the promise to yourself not to be cautious, flawless and wondering. The watchful eyes, they are misjudged. One breath, you're on the cusp. You were 18, now you're 21. Drew their lines and they changed their minds. You were 18, now you're 21. Housed by rules, now you're free to run. You were 18, now you're 21. Drew their lines and they changed their minds. You were 18, now you're 21. Housed by rules, now you're free. Remember when people told you that you can't be dreaming? The present luxury's fading like the air that you're breathing. Remember when you were 3, filling your lung without question, the first time that you fell in the sea. And could you ever imagine if they board up the ocean, the cracks come immediately? The watchful eyes, they are misjudged. One breath, you're on the cusp. You were 18, now you're 21. Drew their lines and they changed their minds. You were 18, now you're 21. House by rules, now you're free to run. You were 18, now you're 21. Drew their lines and they changed their minds. You were 18, now you're 21. House by rules, now you're free. The watchful eyes, they are misjudged. One day they'll see you were 18, now you're 21. Drew their lines and they changed their minds. You were 18, now you're 21. House by rules, now you're free to run. You were 18, now you're 21. Drew their lines and they changed their minds. You were 18, now you're 21. House by rules, now you're free to run. You were 18, now you're 21. Drew their lines and they changed their minds. You were 18, now you're 21. House by rules, now you're free to run. You're free to run. Thank you.
So over the last couple of years, we've been kind of working on this project in turning kind of my life story and the story of our band into a Broadway musical. We've been talking to this writer and director who wanted to adapt it for the Broadway stage. And so Joe and I just started writing songs kind of for fun to see what it would look like to kind of bring this to life. And one of those songs is something that we call No Apologies. We'd like to share that with you this morning. So imagine that we were on the stage with the setting of a Chinese restaurant, because that's kind of where I grew up. So imagine those kind of deep red velvet plush booths and that whole thing. And on the stage, I'm with my band, but it's my old band, the punk band that I dropped out of college to join. And in this scene, I'm about to quit because I'm frustrated because all they care about is fortune and fame. They've lost sight of the most important thing, the music. But it's all right because I got an idea for a new band, an Asian American band. And this song is from that moment.
2 years and 100 gigs. All I got is a demo and a beat up rig. Why the hell did I drop out of school for this? When 40 bucks and 40 fights, we spilled our blood but never saw our name in lights. I gave everything but only got regrets. And I'm sick of pleasing everyone. I'm gonna write new songs, I'm gonna change our sound, I'm gonna take a chance, I'm gonna take a stand, I'm gonna start again, I'm gonna start a new band. I can see it all so clearly, I want the world to stop and hear me, with no apologies. I can feel the rhythm building, like the pulse my heart is beating. Go sing the song I sing.
So here's the thing. Ever since I was a little kid, all I wanted to do was play music, like it was what I lived and breathed. My parents used to have me and my cousins playing together, and whenever we did, instead of playing games like hide and go seek, we would play band. We would turn on the television set, we'd get pots and pans, whatever noise-making devices we had at our disposal, and we would just scream at the top of our lungs, because that's what we thought rock and roll was. I would go up to my mom, look at the television set, and say, "Mom, that's gonna be me one day."
Since 4 years old, I've had this dream. Built a Roxy stage from photos of a magazine. I said, Mom, one day I'll be on MTV. For years I played till my fingers bleed, but that's no way to earn a PhD. If he only knew what that doubt did to me. Well, I'm sick of pleasing everyone. I'm gonna storm the street, I'm gonna make some trouble, I'm gonna take a chance, I'm gonna take a stand, I'm gonna start again, I'm gonna start a new band. I can see it all so clearly, I want the world to stop and hear me. No apologies, I can feel the rhythm building, like the pulse my heart is beating. But sing the song I sing. I know this has not been done. Our faces are hidden, our voices unspoken, but I'm not just anyone. Yeah, they'll know our names, will have representation. The unheard will stand and rock on.
Now, here's the thing. If you drop out of college to join a punk band, the idea of starting yet another band, well, my parents weren't exactly wild about that idea.
You think you're such a punk rock roller, but Simon, you are getting older. Where's your degree? When you have a wife and baby in the big house in the city, it's called responsibility. Simon's mom is not the best singer in the world.
Well, I still believe in this rock and roll dream.
10 years from now, believe on the center stage I'll sing for our community. Yeah, maybe then you'll see what I was meant to be. You talk about responsibility, you don't care about the music, you're so full of greed. But you never take that dream away from me. I can see it all so clearly, I want the world to stop and hear me. With no apologies, I can feel the rhythm building, like the pulse my heart is beating. We'll sing the song I sing.
So in this part of the musical, the entire kitchen staff comes out to sing along with my parents. They're actually my relatives. They all work for my parents, but they decided to join them by admonishing me using the power of song. So we would like to invite you, this is a way to close out cast, to join in on this and be a part of our little Broadway musical by singing these few simple words. Simon, you are getting older. Let's try it.
Older, Simon, you are getting older. Harmonize.
Simon, you are getting older.
Keep singing. I can see it all so clearly. I want the world to stop and hear me. No apologies. I can feel the rhythm building, like the pulse my heart is beating. So sing the song I sing. 10 years from now, believe on the Hilton Ballroom stage, I'll sing for our community. Maybe then you'll see what I was meant to be.
So thank you so much for having us. It is absolute pleasure to be here today. I get invited to a lot of events, and whenever I have a chance to engage with those in higher education, I always jump at it. It's something I'm very, very passionate about. I was an adjunct instructor for a little bit, so yes, I eventually did go back to school, make my parents happy, and get a degree. So it kind of worked out there. And it's something I also advocate for as a pathway for economic mobility and for success. I think that what you're doing is so important. So from the bottom of our hearts, thank you. Thank you for the work that you do. So I grew up in San Diego, California, as mentioned, and although my career eventually took this path where I ended up playing on many different stages, including being on the stage of the U.S. Supreme Court, my favorite memory of being in the slants actually has not been, the Knitting Factory or the Roxy or even at the Supreme Court. My favorite memory comes from a different place, a very different place, but one that still has to do with the law, and that's the Oregon State Penitentiary. You see, in 2011, our band was invited to play at OSP, the maximum security prison here in Oregon. And as a Johnny Cash fan, I was really excited about that moment. I was like, yo, we're gonna wear all black that day. That's gonna be my Folsom Prison Blues moment. But I didn't really think about what it would mean to send an all-Asian band into a prison with one of the highest populations of neo-Nazis in this country. Didn't think it would be particularly dangerous, even as I was signing those waiver forms saying we wouldn't sue the state if we got injured, stabbed, maimed, shanked, I think. I was like, you gotta fill out this kind of paperwork just to go to high school these days, so we'll be all right. It wasn't until we were going through our second set of metal detectors, when all of our things, our IDs and such, were taken away from us. At that point, we were given these bright orange vests with these big numbers on them, like we were gonna go play flag football. And at that point, I started feeling a bit of those nerves, because one of my bandmates looks at the guard and says, hey, we wear suits and things like that when we're playing. Is it okay if we remove the safety gear? And the guard looks at us and he says, why, sure. But if something happens out there, those vests let us know who not to shoot. So I'm like, yo, can I get 2 of them vests? I don't want to lose mine. And I started getting filled with these nerves, this anxiety, because I realized I didn't know very much about prisons or the people locked up inside of them. Everything I knew came from books, television shows, and movies. They didn't have very good things to say. I mean, this is years before Orange is the New Black, or we could see the prison industrial complex as a vehicle for upholding white supremacy, right? That conversation wasn't happening yet. We just thought, oh, the worst of the worst go here. Drug dealers, rapists, murderers, and that's who we're gonna be paired up with. Eventually, we make our way through the prison, and we end up what's called the Big Yard. Now, the Big Yard is the size of a couple of football fields in length, and it's surrounded by these huge concrete walls. You could see search lights on these towers, as well as mounts for weapons. At the end of the Big Yard was a small concrete stage, kind of similar to the size of this one here, and that's where we were supposed to perform. I astutely noted that the only thing that was going to be separating us from about 2,000 inmates were these bright orange safety cones with a thin line of yellow police tape that said, "Police, do not cross." And of course, I was like, I don't know if they follow these kinds of instructions. I mean, that's why they're here, right? They can't follow instructions, so to speak. The guard looks at us and he says, no, we got a plan. I'm like, well, what is it? He says, well, if something happens out there, see that chain link fence behind you? We just need you to just drop everything and run through. We're on the other side, so as soon as you're through, we'll lock it down. Okay, so if something happens, our lives are in danger, your plan is drop everything and run. And if we make it through in time, that's when you'll lock it down? I mean, where did you get this plan? The Walking Dead? I was like, this is a federal institution. It's supposed to have laws and rules and procedures. You're supposed to have experience with this. Well, we took the stage anyway, and something happens whenever we have a chance to share our art, music, the thing that we just live and breathe and love. Because we're not thinking about the criminal status of people or what college they're repping when they're in the audience. We're just there to share our art form with folks. And it just becomes this really great experience. This small crowd gathers up in front while larger ones walking around enjoying their only hour of outdoor time that day. But let me tell you, when we launched into that cover of Paint It Black by the Rolling Stones, I'll never forget looking out at the sea of orange and blue denim bouncing up and down to the music.
I see a red door and I want it painted black. No colors anymore, I want it to turn black. I see the girls walk by dressed in their summer clothes. I have to turn my head until my darkness goes.
Now, at the end of the concert, I'm hanging out by one of those safety cones, like on the safe side, of course. And I see as this group of large, shirtless white men start approaching me. They're covered head to toe in tattoos. I can't really make out what they are until they get closer and closer. I notice that the man in front has 2 words carved into his chest. White power. I start getting filled with those nerves again. I look for my bandmates, and they're 20 feet away from me, breaking down equipment. I look for the guard, the one of the big plan, and he's 50 feet away, breaking up a different fight. As I turn around, the man is just an arm's length away from me. He looks a bit nervous himself. And I'm just frozen. Like, the only thing going through my mind at that point is that scene in Jurassic Park where they're like, if you don't move, the T-Rex won't see you. It was a little late for that. But he's a bit nervous, and then he hands me a piece of paper and a very sharp pencil. I'm just stuck there until he says those few words that just cuts right through me. It's for my daughter. Will you sign it?
His skin was stained with stories of pain, but he wanted to change. Will you let him? Do you believe? He's asked for forgiveness in his daughter's name. Will you let him? The people live forever, imprisoned by a stain, and nothing could be done to earn a little grace. Did you think we couldn't get this far? This is who we are, this is who we are. And did you think we couldn't get this far? This is who we are, this is who we are.
As I'm signing this flyer, I'm just asking him questions, mostly questions about his daughter, like what grade she's in and what's her favorite animal. And avoiding questions like, so why are you in here? Because it seemed kind of obvious. Just couldn't follow the instructions. But as we're having this exchange, he kind of looks at me and he says, I can't change what's stained into my skin, but I could change what's in my head, what's in my heart. I made a lot of mistakes in my life, and they're ones that I don't want my little girl to make. It was perhaps one of the most powerful experiences I've ever had as a musician. We both walked in there full of assumptions. I'm sure that when him and his friends saw a bunch of Asian dudes taking the stage, that they certainly had their thoughts about us. And believe me, when I saw him, I certainly had a few feelings myself. I was literally judging the guy by his skin. I mean, granted, it said white power up in there, but it wasn't until we had a chance to engage that we saw the humanity in each other and make that connection. I grew up in San Diego, California, and back then, that we didn't have the kind of representation that we do today. So most people who knew about people like me or my family came to that knowledge through books, television shows, and movies as well. But the stuff that was out there was pretty awful. You had movies like with Mickey Rooney pulling his eyes back and making a ridiculous accent, people thinking it was funny. Or characters like Long Duck Dong, these overt stereotypes in the films. And we never had any depth. There was no humanity shared about our community. And so I think as a result, I was bullied as a kid. there was a couple different incidents, but there was this one particular one in 7th grade that always jumps out at me. You see, it was in middle school, and back then, we would take turns cleaning up the PE yard after recess while everyone else would go hit the showers. On this particular day, it was my turn. And as I was picking up the basketballs and the volleyball nets and that sort of thing, I thought I was alone out there until I could feel myself being shoved to the ground. I turn around, and there's 4 guys standing over me. And the thing that terrifies me the most is that they're grinning. They're enjoying that moment. And that's when it begins, just over and over and over again. They hit me in the stomach, they punch me in the face, they throw sand in my eyes, all while yelling 2 words again and again, Jap and Gook. And I'm terrified. I have no idea what to do, until something in me just snaps. I look at them and I said, I'm a chink. That's how stupid you are. You can't even be a racist properly. And they were so shocked, they stopped, and they walked away. You see, I believe there's power in claiming an identity. There's power in saying, you don't get to define who I am, only I get to do that. I think that's a human right, of being able to express yourself and how you see the world and how you want the world to see you. And I think some part of that lesson carried through as I entered in high school. High school is where I met my best friend Kyle, and of course, I started falling in love with punk rock.
Well, I don't care about history. Rock and roll high school, 'cause that's not where I wanna be. Rock and roll high school. I just wanna have some kicks. I just wanna get some chicks. Rock and roll high school.
So Kyle and I were the only 2 punk kids in school. This is way before they even had Hot Topic at the local mall. So the idea of me having this, homemade wallet chain that was created out of safety pins, nobody thought this thing was cool. Nobody except for Kyle. Now one day Kyle shows up and he's got his hair dyed in hot pink. It is spiked into Liberty spikes all over his head. And I was like, yo, Kyle, you look so cool. This is so punk. Well, no one else at school felt that way that day, because all day long you'd hear the whispers, you'd see the finger pointing, you'd hear the laughter, sometimes from students, sometimes from teachers. Now, I was supposed to meet Kyle after school this day, but I was running a bit behind. By the time I got there to the front where the parents are picking up the kids, a very familiar scene was unfolding before me. Kyle, now surrounded by almost a dozen guys, they're just I saw him just getting pushed around. They were just shoving him and just saying the most terrible things. What's wrong with you? What are you, queer or something? And at one point, one of them says, how come your mom lets you walk out the door looking like that? And I was just I couldn't just stand there any longer, so I jumped in. I was like, hey, maybe it's because his mom's not stupid and ignorant like you. Maybe she doesn't judge people by how they look, but by what's on the inside, because that's what counts. Now, I thought this was an excellent answer. I was like, this is literally true. But they didn't feel that way. They instead decided to turn their attention towards me and say, hey, what are you going to do? What are you going to do, Jackie? You going to do something about this? And over and over again, they called me Jackie. And I was like, hey, I'm in classes with a couple of you guys. You know my name's not Jackie. But that's when they go out and say the full thing, Jackie Chan. And all I could think was, I'm not Jackie Chan. The man is significantly older than me. He's got this bulbous nose that's been broken a bunch of times from doing all those stunts. But most importantly, Jackie knows something that I don't. Martial arts. He could school all these guys in a minute. I took 1 week of karate camp with my cousins in 5th grade, and they gave me a white belt with a little yellow piece of tape on it out of pity. It wasn't because I actually demonstrated any knowledge of the martial arts. But I thought back on that 7th grade day and thought, well, maybe it'll work. So I struck the one karate pose that I could remember, and they're like, whoa, hey, we're just messing with you. Simon, right? Yeah, we're in classes together. It was the second time that claiming a stereotype actually helped me out. Now, I wish I could say all my experiences growing up as a kid ended with cleverness, wit, and bravery. But the reality is, like, growing up in San Diego, it almost always ended up in the same kind of way, with me running away, trying to find a place to hide, and crying because I didn't want to get hit again. In 11th grade, I walked up to my dad. I said, "Dad, I'm ashamed of being Chinese. I just broke my parents' heart because they worked so hard for me and my siblings. But I was just getting tired of getting killed out there." And fast forward a few years, I am at UC Riverside with a double major and a full ride scholarship, just a couple months away from graduating, and I do the unthinkable thing. I drop out, move across the country to join a punk band in Portland, Oregon. Now, nobody told me before I moved to Portland that it actually has a nickname. People call it America's whitest major city. And there, in America's whitest major city, or here, I should say, I started feeling lonely. I started missing hearing my first languages. I started missing anyone who's looked like me. I started missing the food. And so to deal with this loneliness, I started importing movies. Mostly like VHS tapes of like Jackie Chan, because he is kind of a badass. But I just, this is all I had. And so around the same time period, it was 2004, someone says, "Hey, Simon, did you ever catch the movie Kill Bill?" I'm like, "No, I missed it in the theaters because I was out on tour." But they thought I would like it since I was into all these Triad and Yakuza movies, so I bought it. I'll never forget the day it comes out. I buy it on DVD. I'm watching this yellow disc with these 3 black lines slide into that DVD player. And as it kicks off, it's got some witty banter. I mean, it's a Tarantino film. But there's this one particular scene where this woman named Oren Ishii begins walking into the restaurant with her gang of crazy 88s. It's the Yakuza, or the Asian mafia that she leads. And there's something about the scene that just strikes me as different. And that's when I realized it's the first time that I had ever seen an American-produced film that shows Asians as cool, confident, and sexy. And so that night, I started thinking about music, the art that I lived and breathed since I was a kid. And I thought, if Hollywood is bad, wow, music's worse, because I'd never seen an Asian on the cover of Rolling Stone or Paste or Spin Magazine or MTV back when they used to play music videos. So I was like, something needs to change. And that's when the idea for an Asian American band was born. Well, Band 101, if you want to start a band, like for any deans here, if you want to get together and start your own rock group, I highly recommend the experience. But if you want to start one, you gotta have a name. And so I started asking my friends in America's whitest major city, hey, what's something you think all Asian people have in common? And again they would say slanted eyes. I'm like, slanted eyes? First of all, it's not true. Not all Asian people have slanted eyes. And second of all, we're not the only people on the planet with any kind of slant to our eyes. But I thought back on those experiences about being bullied. I always was ashamed of my eyes because they were what got me beat again and again in school. And I knew, since Asians are some of the most bullied demographics in American schools, that there were other kids who felt the same. But I thought, what if we could change it? What if we could turn this thing upside down? So instead of feeling embarrassment, people felt empowerment. Instead of associating slanted eyes with fear, they felt like a sense of pride. And so that's when the idea for the Slants was born. Now, I never in my whole life imagined what would happen next. We announced this thing on myspace.com, which lets you know how far back this thing goes. And we started getting all these notes from across the country. Kids writing in letters, sometimes physically mailing me letters saying, "Thank you. Thank you for existing. Thank you for showing me what's possible, that I could for giving me a reason to be proud of my heritage." And I started realizing that whether we liked it or not, that we would kind of be judged by our work. I mean, we were like the only ones out there. So we started trying to up our own education, both taking classes on diversity, equity, inclusion, as well as counseling classes, because many of these kids felt uncomfortable talking to the parents or the school administrators. They would talk to us whenever they felt troubled, emotionally distraught, or traumatized. And so we became that resource for them. We started also kind of sharing more of our own stories of being bullied. You see, my singer and I, we kind of grew up being faced with a very familiar taunt. Kids would come up to us and say, Chinese, Japanese, dirty knees, look at these. And they'd pull their eyes back in a slant eye gesture. I thought, well, if we could do this with a name, why can't we take this old schoolyard rhyme that was filled with hate, flip it, and turn it into an anthem of pride instead? And so that's when we decided to pick up our guitars, start writing, and the song Sakura Sakura was born.
We come from another school that doesn't wanna be the same. Against the greatest rhythm, the social tempo is about to change. And then you'll see it and you eloquently wanna be the one. And then you'll reach it, it will burn you up like the rising sun. We sing for the Japanese and the Chinese and on the dirty knees. Can you see me? We sing in harmony. We sing for the Japanese and the Chinese and on the dirty knees. Can you see me? We sing in harmony. Pick up the pieces, put them back in order, and try not to confine all of your reasonings to reality of surrounding time. We sing for the Japanese and the Chinese and all the dirty knees. Can you see me? We sing in harmony. We sing for the Japanese and the Chinese and all the dirty knees. Can you see me? We sing in harmony.
I'll never forget the first time that, thank you. The first time that NPR did a story on us. This is back in 2008. And it started out as a story on OPB, Oregon Public Broadcasting, and eventually gets syndicated on All Things Considered. They talked about this Asian American band that was touring and turning stereotypes upside down, all while building a geek army. Now, they called it a geek army because we were playing anime conventions back then. Now we're doing events like councils for deans of colleges of arts and sciences. Maybe a little less geeky. Still totally geeky, all right. And it was just such an incredible time. I mean, we just felt like a spirit of like we were actually seeing things happen. We started dedicating, doing fundraisers for different causes. For example, we saw how Asian American women face disparity rates in terms of treatment and recovery, 8 times higher than any other ethnic identity. So we started raising money to provide research into that area. We got involved with anti-bullying campaigns and just doing all kinds of worked with over 100 community organizations across this country to bring attention to issues that were being faced by our community and other communities that were facing similar kind of things where we can just kind of build coalitions around. Not the typical work of a rock and roll band, but it was what we felt like we needed to do. And that put us on the road a whole lot. And what I thought was really interesting is that as we were touring the country, we'd be playing places like the Deep South or in New York City or all these other things. And what's fascinating, like growing up in the U.S., is like you start picking up on ideas of what people must be like, who, people who live in Alabama or Texas or New York or California and so on. But the more that we actually interacted with people, the more we realized that they weren't quite there. Like, they weren't the stereotypes that they are portrayed to be. And at the same time, the U.S. has all these ideas about itself being the land of freedom and of equality and access. And we realized that it also wasn't quite living up to those ideas as well. And that's where we kind of started thinking that, like, they weren't just a collection of ideas that, were statements of fact. I think they were trying to be ideas that the country itself was trying to live up to.
I've been spending all my time on these freeways, thinking about shorter nights and long summer days. I only see you through dirty windows and glimpses under neon glow. We've got so many miles ahead. You're always present, but you're not attainable. Like a hungry ghost, but not attainable. I can see all your stripes under the stars and glimpses on them in every bar and every song in my head. 'Cause I'm holding on to ideas of you, but they're the ones you can never live up to. Yes, I'm holding on to ideas of you. Should I let go and hold on to something new?
As we were touring and making headway, and we were blowing up and getting radio play and all this stuff, everything started falling apart, as it often will when you become friends with an attorney. Spencer Trowbridge, who's still a good friend of mine today, is an IP attorney in Portland, Oregon. He says, hey, you're playing all these shows, you're doing all these tours, you're getting these interviews and things. Have you ever thought about registering your trademark? I'm like, that sounds kind of expensive. But he assures me it's only a few $100 and the whole thing will be over in like 6 months. So I decide, sure, let's go for it. This is back in 2009. In 2010, Spencer calls me up and he says, hey, we got a problem. Like, well, what is it? Did I fill out the paperwork incorrectly or something? He says, no, all that's fine. But the trademark office says that the name of your band is disparaging to persons of Asian descent. And I'm like, wait, does disparaging mean what I think it means? Are they saying we're racist to Asian people? And he says, yeah. I didn't even know there was a law against this. I mean, there's all kinds of offensive stuff out there. Like, what does the law actually say? And so he proceeds to read me Section 2A of the Lanham Act that says you can't register trademarks that are considered scandalous, immoral, or disparaging. But it's not just what anybody thinks. They have to find what's called a substantial composite of the reference group. They got to find it disparaging for them to deny you this under the law. So I'm like, okay, well, we just spent the last couple years touring and working with all these community organizations. Who did they find who's actually offended by our name? And that's when he says, no one. Like, no one. You just said it has to be a substantial composite. He says, nobody. But they did quote urbandictionary.com. And there's photos of Miley Cyrus pulling her eyes back in a slant eye gesture. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. He's like, no, I'm looking at Miley right now. It's pretty offensive. I'm like, yes, I know Asian Twitter was on that already, but you're telling me that a federal court system is using a wiki joke website as evidence, like stuff that wouldn't even be acceptable in a junior high classroom? And he says, yeah. He says, yeah, I think they're wrong. And I'm like, well, what do we do? He says, what else can we do but fight back?
Reaching out, reaching through ghostly hands in abandoned rooms. Where's the charge? This hollow march faked you out with fits and starts. Don't let the words this way, don't let the text prevail, don't let the weakness of others infect your health. Don't be their alibis, don't feed their greedy mouth. If it's time, then it's now. Stand up tall and fight back rather than just sit back. Fly your way through the feedback. Don't get caught in that, don't get caught in that. Just react, heart and mind remain intact. Tooth and nail will not retract. Lead the pack as it's your time now, it's your time now. Fight back rather than just sit back. Fly your way through the feedback. Don't get caught in that, don't get caught in that. Just react, heart and mind remain intact. Tooth and nail will not retract. Lead the pack as it's your time now, it's your time now.
So what would you do to prove that you're not offensive to yourself? Like, think about it. What kind of evidence would you bring to the table to prove that kind of thing? Well, in our case, what we did is we worked with community leaders, so executive directors of numerous Asian American social justice groups who wrote letters, legal declarations of support. We demonstrated how every single Asian American newspaper, magazine, television show in the country supported our work that we were doing. We got professors to help us out as well. One out of Duke University who wrote a huge paper on the history of the term slant, demonstrating how even in the height of its use, it wasn't considered all that offensive in the 30s and 40s, but how more often than not, Asian Americans were using it in this reappropriated manner for self-empowerment. And we worked with a couple of law professors, including one in attendance here today, who took an independent national survey to kind of feel out what our community was saying. We found that 92 to 98% of Asian Americans supported our use of the name. It was the biggest appeal in U.S. history under a 2A rejection, the type of law we were facing. We send all this in, and the trademark office says it's not good enough. It's not good enough because UrbanDictionary.com says so. And they decided to also cite a dictionary, not a contemporary American dictionary, because most of them had actually phased out the offensive definition, but they pulled out one from the 1920s, a British dictionary of all dictionaries of slang. And with a few keystrokes, they basically wiped away the voices of thousands of Asian Americans who participated in this process, deciding that they didn't need to speak to a single one of us about how we felt about the issue. They called our effort, said it was laudable, but not influential. And after 2 years of working on this, my attorney, Spencer, says, you know what, law is really hard. I'm not going to renew my license next year, so you're going to have to find someone else. And so we ended up working with this law firm out of New Jersey, of all places, and they say, hey, you know what, as long as you fight like this, you're not going to win. You're not going to win because the thing is, with this law, in the 70 years of its existence, no one has ever won on appeal, which is wild to think about. Like, in the 70 years, the government says, hey, here's the law. We think it's fair. If we're wrong, just appeal, and we'll correct the issue. But not a single case had ever been successful. So my attorneys say, maybe we should reapply. We'll abandon this application, and we'll reapply, and we won't tell them it's for an Asian ban. And then we'll see what happens. So we go ahead and reapply, but the office, the trademark office, gives us the exact same examining attorney. That attorney copies and pastes his previous rejection into ours, which frustrates me to no end. But my attorneys are actually happy about it. They're like, no, we caught them. They broke their own rules. You see, they're supposed to do a fresh search every time a new application comes in. They didn't. Look at the screenshots. You can see that all the evidence predates your application by 2 years. On top of that, they're supposed to do independent search to figure out how the market actually feels about it. But they didn't find anything offensive when they looked for your ban. They only found your ban. The only time they found anything derogatory in connection to the word slant was when they Googled slant plus the word derogatory plus the N-word, although that's not how the government wrote that one. And so we started appealing on this, saying, hey, look at this procedural and evidentiary issues, and none of the courts cared. We appeal all the way. And meanwhile, we decided, let's just stop and reframe the question. Let's take a different perspective on this. So we said, hold on a second. If slant is really inherently offensive like you claim it is, how come you gave it to everybody else? You see, there had been almost 800 trademark applications for the word slant. Only one in all U.S. history was denied for being disparaging, and that was my case. So we're like, what is it about the slants that's different than Slant Shack or Slant No Rant or Slanted Records or all these other trademarks that you gave out that without an issue? And they came back and they said, it's because y'all are just too Asian. And they said, like, if you go to the slants.com, there's photos of Asian people all over it. I'm like, yeah, that's my face. This is like my band. But you see, in their minds, they basically said, like, if people see the words the slants and they see our faces, they can't help but think of the racially disparaging term. Which led me to think, like, wow, if you were to actually chart out the logic of this, it would look something like this. Like, the more Asian we become, the more we're associated with Asian culture, the more racist we are to ourselves, which, of course, doesn't make sense at all. And the problem isn't that we just happen to be a band with a couple of Asian dudes in it. The problem is that our band is like super duper Asian. I mean, you got to remember, like, we were not only doing things that, like, were reappropriating old schoolyard rhymes, we were out there doing work with community organizations all across this country. You could not separate our band from the Asian American identity that we were claiming and working with when it came to our audiences and the kids that we were serving. So the only way around it was if I fired all the Asian members of my band and replaced them with white people, or the law needed to change. We brought all this to the court system, and they didn't care. They said, we don't care if they're using your identity against you, which, seemed like a constitutional issue to me, but, They did say, like, maybe what's happening is that the law is actually infringing on your freedom of speech. So we're like, yeah, let's go with that one. We take this all the way to the federal court system, one step below the Supreme Court. And there, after 6.5 years of fighting in the court system, 9 out of 12 federal judges agreed with us, striking the law down as unconstitutional. I thought the saga was over then, but 6 months later, we still didn't have a trademark registration. That's because I found out that the Trademark Office, along with their new BFFs, the Department of Justice, decided to file suit and take me, here. The final boss stage in any kind of, like, legal journey, right? And so all along, this was kind of a frustration of mine, because I thought, like, a lot of the things I was trying to express were principles, ethics that I believed to be true, things that I thought were important, but they did not make very good legal arguments. I was up against an institution, a system, and sometimes ethics and institutions kind of clash. And so my lawyers had to adopt a more institutional legal argument where I was, like, focused on the principle of the matter. For example, I was like, if there's going to be a bunch of people arguing about what's offensive to Asian people, well, some Asian people better be up in there, because they never let us be a part of that conversation. So we crowdfunded our way to Washington, D.C. And even though my name was literally on the case, I was not guaranteed a spot in the room. My lawyers actually had to fight to make that happen. And so, we just thought it was important. We wanted the justices to look at us and say that they knew better than us when it came to the needs of our community. And we flew out there, and the other thing that we decided to use was use the stage or our own megaphone or our own microphone that we could. I couldn't be speaking in the courtroom, so why not use the one place where we could express ourselves? And that was through our art. We decided to release an album that year, and we dedicated that album to the U.S. government. We called it The Band Who Must Not Be Named. And we kicked off the album with a song that we wanted to use as an open letter to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. But really, it was for anybody else who did not believe in the power of reappropriation. The idea that people can take stigmatizing words and phrases and ideas and turn them into badges of pride. Because I was like, we need to be able to use irony, satire, and wit to neuter hate in this world. And so, the song From the Heart was born from that.
No, we won't remain silent, no. It's our defining moment. We sing from the heart. We sing from the heart. And no, we won't be complacent, no. It's a rock and roll nation. We sing from the heart. We sing from the heart.
Now, much to the chagrin of my attorneys, we actually did play this song on the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court. It's just one of those things that we had to do. But it's all right, because it was a federal holiday, and they kind of bend the rules a bit on those days. You see, it was Martin Luther King Jr. Day, the same day that we decided to release our album. And to celebrate, we actually took our guitars and went to the MLK Memorial that night. It happens to be my favorite place in D.C. If you haven't been there, it is just absolutely majestic. Some of Dr. King's greatest words are carved into stone throughout, and especially at night, it's lit up. It's just so inspiring. Well, that night, as we were there, I wanted to take some time out for myself. You see, by the time we got there, it had been 7 years of fighting. So long, in fact, that every other original band member of mine had left the band. I was there with a new group. And while they were certainly supportive of the cause, they didn't have those same experiences and memories that I did of those early years, especially when we were just trying to figure out our own identity. And so I wanted to just kind of meditate on each of these quotes and just spend some time thinking before we ended up at the court. And my eyes eventually fell upon perhaps my favorite quote from Dr. King. It says that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I remember looking at those words and thinking, that's true. That's true, but that moral arc does not bend on its own. You see, it requires patience, it requires persistence, and it requires people willing to fight and to be proactively part of bending it with intention. And as if it were some kind of sign from the universe or something like that to bring me back full circle, the night before we were due at the court, we found ourselves in a Chinese restaurant in Chinatown, being interviewed by a journalist from China. And at the end of the meal, we're served fortune cookies. Yeah, I think it's kind of funny because I grew up in a Chinese restaurant, never really thought a whole lot about the fortune cookie. That's kind of a hokey thing. But that night, as I cracked open the cookie and I pulled out the slip of paper inside, well, I thought, maybe there's something to this thing after all. I try and get some sleep. Of course I don't. And, the next morning we're getting out of a car and we're standing before this building. This building, with its kind of Roman Colosseum-like feel, as if it were gladiators preparing for combat, it actually has 4 words carved into it in front: equal justice under law. And I remember thinking, I hope that's true today. I hope that's true, because almost every other time that my community came up before this court and this governing body, we didn't receive anything that looked like that, because it was the same governing body that it would be okay to ban people from China. We're still experiencing the effects of that to this day, of what it was like to ban an entire country. It was the same governing body that thought it was okay to lock up American citizens of Japanese descent and put them into concentration camps on our own soil. So I was like, equal justice under law, I don't have a lot of hope. But we walk into the room and we get seated, and it's kind of fascinating because they give us the TSA pre-check version of this thing. We skip the line, we go through the side. There's a lot of detectives involved. We eventually get led to the second row of these benches. You see, the Supreme Court is actually fairly small, and you got a couple of tables. That's where the attorneys are arguing from. You got a few rows of chairs, nice chairs with padding on them. Then you got these hard wooden pews. That's for the common people like us, and that's where we were seated, in the second row of these pews. Well, as the room begins to fill in, you got to imagine the scene. This is full of people who've been following the saga for almost a decade. So it's a ton of law students and faculty from law schools and things like that. They look up and they see 4 Asian dudes in suits up front. So of course they start whispering and pointing, and then they're one of them's like, "Are you in the band?" I'm like, "Yeah." And they start making a commotion. They start waving their hands, trying to signal that court martial to come over. And they're like, hey, this is Tam of the case being argued before the court today. Levy Tam, like, doesn't he at least get to sit in the front row of this section? Well, the marshal says, well, I got to check with the Solicitor General. I'm like, that's the dude we're arguing against today. But all right. He leaves, and 10 minutes later, he comes back to me, and he looks at me and says, I'm sorry, Mr. Tam, but we're reserving the seat in case someone important shows up today. Like, yo, you gotta just cut me down like that. But like, that's how I felt this whole time. That's how I felt, like, just throughout these years and years and years dealing with the whole thing. And it doesn't matter anyway, because like as soon as that gavel hits and this kind of proclamation is made to welcoming the justices in, like the men and women in black robes start filing in, and my eyes are just fixated on what is happening in front of me. Now, a lot of people ask me what it's like. Like, what's it like being in the Supreme Court, especially with your name on the thing? And I always say it's really weird, because they are using my name. They're using the name of my band. But the person they're talking about doesn't sound anything like me or my band, because they're talking about somebody who's offensive, someone who's doing destructive things to its own community. And I was like, that's not me. That's not me. Like, you weren't there when our band decided to take up this work, the reason why we even chose our name to begin with. You weren't there as we decided to dedicate 100% of our profits to fund research in protecting Asian women. And you certainly weren't there as I was talking to those kids, telling them not to take their own lives because it does get better. Sharing our story and changing the culture. I was like, you don't know me. You don't deserve to use my name. But, of course, I can't say anything. I am in the nation's highest court fighting for freedom of expression. And in that room, I can't say a damn thing. About halfway through the arguments, though, this little voice pops up. It's Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She looks at the government and she says, doesn't it matter that everyone knows the slants are Asian? They're not using the word to disparage, but to describe and to remove the sting from the term. And I was like, yo, I think I'm in love with the Supreme Court justice. Notorious RBG throwing it down. And the only thing that the government attorney could say was like, well, we found a lot of articles on the internet that suggested otherwise, and I wanted to get up and say, no, you're talking about urbandictionary.com, son. You're not talking about like what our community is saying. But of course, I just had to sit there. I just had to listen. 55 minutes elapsed, the whole thing's over. It just flies by. And as we're gathering our things at the lockers, like picking up our jackets and phones and that sort of thing, I'm just like, I don't know. I don't think they get it. And so we walk outside and we start walking down the steps of the court, and just I'm thinking like, does anyone get it? I noticed that the plaza in front of the court, it's filled with hundreds and hundreds of people. I'm like, what are they all doing here? The court's in session. Like, there's no tours today. They don't get it. But we're about halfway down through the steps when the crowd looks up and they see us. And they break out in applause. They begin cheering for us as we walk down. And I'm like, what is happening here? We hit those final steps, and these two Asian kids run up to me. Simon, our parents let us ditch school to be here today. I'm like, yo, what kind of Asian parents do you have? And they're like, no, you don't get it. We came here from California. You see, we're freshmen in high school. So for our whole lives, we heard about you. We heard about the one who's willing to fight for the dignity of our community, for us to choose what's appropriate for ourselves. And it's funny. For so many years, I studied this law in and out. I thought I knew everything about trademark law. I even wrote a law review article about it, which I guess you're supposed to technically be a lawyer to do, but they made it work anyway. And these kids summed it up in just a single word better than I ever could. The fight for equity is really about dignity. It doesn't cost anything to extend grace or dignity to other people, but it means so much to those folks. And these kids, they told me, they said, like, we're only freshmen in high school, but we wanted to come here to meet you, and to tell you that when we graduate, we're going to go to study public policy development in college. And when we're done there, we're going to run for office, and we're going to change the system that you fought against. And I remember thinking, I was like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if we win or lose in that courtroom today. Because now I see what started. That it was more about that other generation. And I've been meditating about this for the last couple of weeks in my life as well. I was just thinking, like, every tidal wave begins with a ripple. Or that ripple might begin from like a pebble being dropped into a lake. It might begin with movement underneath the earth. But it gives every wave the potential to not only reshape the very ocean that it sits in, but the land that it presses against. There's no drop of water that's more important than any other drop of water. But when it works together collectively, there's untold power in that. And I think that's the story of our communities as well. Like sometimes you have to work in unconventional ways to make it happen. Sometimes you work within the system, sometimes you press against it. But it's about that continual process of pressing for justice and dignity for other people. And so at the end of this exchange, I walk over and meet my attorneys. They're at the corner of the plaza where this like media circus has started to gather, cameras and microphones of journalists from all over. And they're all asking like for a statement. And my attorneys did not prepare a statement. You see, it was their first time at the court. Like, I kind of taking selfies up in there. Like, so they didn't know about that. But they look at me and they're like, Simon, do you want to say something? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. So I got up on the mic and I said that which no one was willing to say in the courtroom. I said, if the government truly cared about fighting against racism while using this trademark law to do so, well, why didn't they begin by canceling the registrations of the KKK or Stormfront? Why did they begin by launching this war against an anti-racist band? Maybe it's because they don't actually care. Maybe it's because they want to use so-called bad language instead of looking at bad law. I mean, I called it bad law because we found something else out. We were not the only people that were too Asian. Think about it. Who are the kinds of people that tend to reappropriate language? Communities of color and members of the LGBTQ community. Turns out it made us targets under the law. When you looked at the impact of the law, there was a disparate impact amongst communities traditionally marginalized by the system. Women, people of color, queer folk were all being slammed by this law, while other companies, including like porn companies, were getting the benefit of the doubt for the very same words that we were trying to reappropriate. So when we shone a light on that, the government didn't like that, and they decided to just push back, hoping we would just give up in the process. 6 months later, I'm waking up. It's 6 a.m. My phone is blowing up. I missed over 700 notifications. So I'm like, I guess something happened. It is, of all days, June 19th, Juneteenth. And I hop on Twitter, and it's OPB, the very first NPR affiliate that broke the story of an Asian American man turning stereotypes upside down. They write in a single tweet, the Supreme Court rules in favor of the slants. Later that day, I found out that decision was unanimous. And so what do you do after you spend so much of your life, a quarter of your life in the court system, and you win a case at the Supreme Court? Well, our band decides to do the inevitable thing, retire. In fall of 2019, we swear we did not know there was going to be a pandemic to shut down stages. We decided to retire from live rock and roll touring with the full band, and instead we decided to launch a nonprofit organization, the Slants Foundation, so we could now empower another generation of folks working to use art and activism to shift the culture and transform systems. And so it's kind of funny because like all my life I wanted to be this rock star, I wanted to be on MTV, wanted to tour and do all this stuff. And I didn't realize that what it really came down to was like I wanted this idea of expression, from like pushing back on those kids to fighting for our name. It was about the ability to express oneself in a way that provides dignity, and use that as a way to help reshape the ocean that we sit in. And maybe even change the idea of what a band could even be. Not only what I could be as a person, but what our group could be. And so perhaps in that particular way, as we continue to empower now filmmakers and dancers and theater folks and other musicians, that's a way that our band, even though we're retired, that we can continue to play on.
And the band plays on, even when hope is gone. You were my favorite song, and the band plays on, even when hope is gone. You were my favorite song, and the band plays on, and the band plays on.
Thank you so much for having us today.
Thank you to Simon and Joe for a wonderful presentation. We do have some time for a few questions. If Simon and Joe would like to take some questions. Oh, Joe is running. You want to take some questions? Sure. Yeah. So there are some microphones around if folks have any questions for them.
I'm just curious, all this legal work you had done, was it pro bono, or how did you afford it if not?
Well, it didn't start out pro bono. I got kind of a discount rate. And then my attorneys were very gracious and ended up doing it pro bono. But the court fees are just unbelievable. I mean, I actually left being a full-time musician about halfway into it and started taking side hustles. And that's actually how I ended up being an adjunct. I was teaching at 3 colleges to try and pay some legal bills. So I was doing that and on top of some other work. But yeah, I think this is the reason why so many people give up too, because we basically calculated out all the pro bono work from everybody that contributed to this case. If they did not help us, we probably would have spent over $2 million trying to fight for something. And in the end, it's not like the government's like, oh, we're gonna reimburse you for the years of your life or the dollars you spent. At the end of the day, we got a trademark registration. And the ironic thing is, like, they forgot to mail it to me until a year later, and I had to pay more fees to get it expedited, because I was like, I want to frame this thing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Someone running in. Jonathan, go ahead.
You mentioned that you're working on a Broadway musical. Is that still happening? Is that in process?
Yeah, we're still working on the musical. We got a couple projects that, you know, it's not a fast process. It takes about as long as a court case, it seems. So, but we got a kind of a draft script, and Joe and I just keep composing songs, and so no matter what happens, I think it's helping us create art, and that's something I've been really happy with.
So at what point did your family, parents especially, turn around to appreciate what you're doing?
I think for the longest time, my parents had no idea what I was doing. In fact, they still don't know what I do for a living, so that's kind of funny. It wasn't until very, very late in the process. Like, I remember in 2013, I called my dad. I was like, Dad, I'm in Time Magazine. I was really excited about this thing, and he's like, so? I don't read Time. I was like, Dad, it's kind of a big deal. And he's just like, I don't know. Like, he was afraid, like, if I continue to push, that I would get in trouble. Because, like, you know, he left, you know, a lot of my family left communist China as political refugees. And in that system, you push too hard, you end up in prison. It wasn't until after we won, like maybe June 20th or 21st, my mom calls me up, and it turns out that we were in the Chinese newspaper, like the largest Chinese printed newspaper in North America, and we were on the front page. And my dad's like really excited. He's like, "You're on the Chinese newspaper." I was like, "Yeah, I told you it was kind of a thing." But I also found out later that day, he went around and drove all over San Diego to buy as many copies as he could, and he told everyone, "That's my son." And so I think that's when I was like, oh, maybe he said those words that like don't really come out of Asian parents' mouths. I'm proud of you, but I think he felt it. So, yeah, that's when I kind of knew.
So this may be cheating a little bit, but as deans of colleges for arts and sciences, my question to you is, how could we in higher education serve young people and adults better in terms of nurturing this kind of passion and making exploration of creativity compatible with earning a degree and looking for jobs?
I mean, I absolutely think it's compatible, and I think this is the challenge of higher education, right? Like to repackage, like what is the value proposition for a student, especially since I think there was a study just published this year saying like kids without four-year degrees are out earning those with four-year degrees in certain sectors. And so I think like understanding it's not just about the piece of paper, it's not just about the institution, it's who you become as a result of the process. It's like learning to challenge yourself and engage. How that gets communicated, I think, is going to be a challenge. But I'm a firm believer in working with community organizations and improving access to that, especially for communities of color. I think a lot of folks, including members of my family, they didn't even think college was possible. So there's a lot of really great organizations out there, like educating folks, like how to, apply for FAFSA, how to like get enrolled, and what those initial steps are. So I think there's like the procedural part for sure, like the institutional part, and then the second is like involving students in those decisions and saying like maybe having them like. I don't know of any college that's really like having young people part of the board of directors. Like, why not have that student voice really be present and in a meaningful way where they feel heard? And so I think that there's like systems, there's institutions, there's the culture that we're all like trying to like move the little levers on. But, I think all those things, and then being willing to step back and say like, okay, we've been doing it this way for so long. How can we approach this from a completely different perspective? What are the other questions that will unlock our creativity to solve this kind of problem? So perhaps all those things combined. You could also bring more musicians to campus.
Any other questions for Simon?
Do you travel to the East Coast?
I live in the East Coast, well, Midwest now. I live in Cincinnati, Ohio now. But yeah, I haven't traveled in a long time. This is the first fly-out gig I've had in like 2 years, so I wasn't even sure if this was happening. But yeah. And if folks are interested in getting more, like hearing more of the story, we got some books, and I think like 3 copies of our CD left, so we got that in the back too. But happy to trade info if you want, or I also know a lot of great speakers whose voices I think deserve to be heard as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you for being here, and thank you to Simon for a great performance. And once again, thank you for attending the closing plenary session. We look forward to seeing you all in Washington, D.C. come November of next year. Thank you for being here.